Thank you very much for coming. My name's Jack Cunliffe. So I met Matt the other day when he was offering a free trailer thing for the back of my bike or the kids, and we got chatting. And he mentioned that this thing happens, and he was like, "Would you like to do a speak?" And I was like, "I would absolutely love to. There's nothing I love more than sort of chatting about my research. Really, most of the time I spend arguing about resources now because I've got to that point in my career where I no longer get to do research and start to getting sucked into management." So I'm going to talk about drugs, crime and communication technologies. Basically, I'm a criminologist, I'm not a geek like you lot, if you don't mind me saying. So when I was little, I did further maths, chemistry and physics at A-level. And I thought about what I should do for a degree, and I really liked maths, but I was good at physics and I was good at engineering. And I wanted to do engineering, but at the last minute I chose to do maths, because everyone assured me that I'd be able to do anything with that degree once I left university. Turns out what you can do with a maths degree is you can either be an actuary or an accountant. So I ended up not doing that and moving into social research. And then through one thing or another I've ended up as a criminologist, which it's kind of an offshoot of sociology, and what we do is we try and study the artefacts of crime, basically. We're kind of a funny subject in that we sort of define ourselves, we're one of a few subjects which define ourselves around an act. So we define ourselves around the act of crime. And within that, there's a whole swathe of different research approaches that you can take. A lot of people take very qualitative approaches, conversations. Some people take more technical approaches. Some people study the police. Some people study all sorts of things. I seem to be studying drugs and cybercrime more generally. There's a number of different things I thought I could speak about. I run a course, it's just started on Tuesday, called Technology Control and Cybercrime, where I do a whole bunch of theory and stuff like that, and then I do a whole bunch of case studies. I've done some stuff about fraud, online fraud. I've done some stuff about some of the darker things that happen on the internet, but my main research area is, as I say, drugs. The internet has kind of got a nefarious start point, right? Computers themselves have got a nefarious start point. You can keep on going back, all the way back to abacuses, which were kind of the first computers in many ways. A lot of the impetus to develop better computing was to crack codes. So it was to hide communication, and then they were used to crack communication. The Enigma machine, that was actually cracked by a couple of Polish guys way before the Lorenz machine, which was the main one, which had 10 ciphers, which was what the Nazis were using to communicate. And I could keep on going back and back and back, but one of the first things I'm going to start with is the ARPANET. The ARPANET, you know what that is?
Yeah.
Yeah? So, one of the first ever, there's kind of this old adage that the first people to adopt new technology is pornography. And the first ever financial transaction is reputed, I don't know how true this is, to have been in 1971, so somewhere in between when it was this and this in terms of the network, for two students that were going to a conference. One was on the west coast, one was on the east coast, and they communicated to say, "Can you bring me a bag of weed, please?" And that was the first ever communication for economic transaction that happened through network computers. Was in 1971 for some cannabis. So it's kind of written into the very core of communication, the fact that people try and, when they're doing something illegal, try and hide it from the authorities. Yeah. Of course, in the earlier days of the internet, bulletin boards, some of you might remember these days, relay channels, there was quite a thriving community of people that would use those ways of communicating to arrange to purchase drugs. There was quite a large website called Adam Bomb, which was responsible for quite a lot of trades. But one of the real problems with that was that you couldn't transfer money. It was very difficult to transfer money. You could arrange to transfer products and you could use the postal system, but to actually transfer money, that became very difficult and was always traceable. So you might be using Western Union, you might be using PayPal, whatever it is. If someone got busted, then all those transactions are there to be found. It wasn't until the launch of this infamous website, Silk Road, in 2011, was it? 2012? 2011, Silk Road, by this chap, Ross Ulbricht, who's serving an unfeasibly long amount of time in American jail. Although Donald Trump says he might pardon him, which is kind of weird, but that's a whole nother story about these sort of crypto bros that are trying to take over the American government. But this was kind of the first website that actually managed to crack it, yeah? And this chap says that he didn't really invent anything new, he just put the pieces together. And those pieces were hidden services on the Tor network, Bitcoin, escrow, that's about it really. So he defined a system which allowed people to set up shops to sell whatever they wanted, predominantly drugs. He did have some terms and conditions. You couldn't sell child pornography on there, you couldn't sell guns. So predominantly drugs and a payment system using Bitcoin. And it was quite ground-shaking in its sort of impact. Loads of people started using it. It was an article by Chen in 2012 that sort of brought it to the world attention. A colleague of mine, Monica Barrett, wrote a piece saying that criminologists must watch this space in 2013. And yeah, it sort of set the paradigm. Now, Ross, Dread Pirate Roberts, got busted in a library whilst logged into the system, and he's in jail now. There's a lot that's been written and said about some of the things that he's reputed to have done or not done, as the case may be. I don't want to dwell on those, but essentially this idea of the Silk Road sort of set the paradigm for how these markets work. These places where people can sign up to sell drugs and other people go there and there's reviews and feedback. There's like a whole bunch of different websites launched quite shortly afterwards, Silk Road. Once it got taken down, there was a known that people could make money on these things. They were relatively easy to set up by people with the right technical skills, and it developed into quite a large set of different places that came along. Now, we split in this book that we wrote, I think, a whole swathe of different markets. Some of them have reached different levels of prominence. The Silk Road 2, Dream Market was one of the longest lasting. Hansa came along, and you can see the sort of emergence and then the disappearance of these markets as demonstrated by this chart, yeah? But essentially we split this into sort of three epochs in this book that we wrote. There's the emergence of the paradigm, which was like when Silk Road came along and sort of set the terms of engagement. There was a reconfiguration when that got taken down and they sort of started to align to a certain way of doing things. And now there's kind of a settled period whereby markets appear, they last some amount of time. Most of them don't really get past infancy. They get hacked, there's scams, they occasionally, and quite occasionally, get taken down by law enforcement. But predominantly they all work in the same way. You've always got a vendor page that explains some things about the vendor, you've always got the sellers, you've got the products, there's some type of feedback system, and it's very similar to those early days in the Silk Road. However, they are pretty hard to use. So they haven't. At one point, when we were working on this back in 2015, we thought that this was going to replace the whole drug system. That everybody was going to buy everything online. It was going to be like eBay. Nobody would be going to the street dealer anymore. It's not quite worked out like that. There has been an emergence, and you can find it quite quickly. And if I had more time, I'd set you a challenge, which would be try and find a coke dealer that would be willing to bring you cocaine on Telegram now. I bet you could within 10 minutes if I gave you a couple of key search terms. There's a whole lot now of people that have started to sell drugs through social media, right? All of them. Facebook, Instagram, Wicker, Signal, Telegram. The more secure, are perceived to be more secure, but there's people equally hawking their wares across the whole of the internet, basically. So that's the background of what I'm going to talk about. That's just like where we are, where I'm situating my work, and now I'm going to talk about some of my research that I've done and some of the ideas that I've got going forward, which I think are going to be more in line with some of the technical things that I'd imagine you want to hear as sort of a bunch of engineers, or I'm assuming you're a bunch of engineers. Right, so one good thing about these markets being online is that you can rob the information from it, yeah? If you can see it with your eyes on a computer, you can capture it using a script. So I've been working. There was a chap, a computer scientist called Nicholas Christin, who wrote a very early paper on the Silk Road in 2013. So he wrote a very early piece. He is a computer scientist, and he'd spotted this phenomenon, and he started capturing information from the markets. Yeah, he built a custom scraper that went around on tour and captured all the information, all the pages from the websites, and organised it into a data set and started to analyse it. Huge, massive amount of data from this one scrape that happened in the middle of 2013. A good friend of mine and colleague, David DeCarihutu, he wasn't a friend of mine at the time, I met him at a conference and we started working together. He was similarly inclined and also started capturing data. And Nicholas kind of proved it was possible and then kind of left the scene like some type of white knight, just came in, gave us a paradigm and then buggered off. Whereas David started collecting this information from as many markets as he could, and he did it for a number of years. So what he was able to do across most of the large markets was take regular snapshots, and by regular I mean at least once a week, and he did this across as many markets as there were actually had a significant trade on them, by basically lurking around on the internet and finding out how much was happening on them, and he captured it all and collected it into this massive data set.
What data did he collect? Money? Or
so he collected a snapshot of all the websites, basically. He downloaded the entire website. So by that I mean he collected the products that were listed, the product descriptions of those listings, who was selling them, the places that they said they were selling them from, where they were selling them to, the feedbacks that they got, what those feedbacks were, good, bad, most of them are 5 stars, but sometimes you get 1 stars. The vendor descriptions, how long the vendor had been active for, whatever you can get from those websites, he collected and stored in this big database, yeah? And all the pictures, all the metadata, everything. David didn't know what to do with it though, he's not a data analyst. I'm sort of like, that's a data analyst bell. I'm not. David isn't a data analyst. I'm somewhere between a criminologist, a data scientist, and a statistician. Yeah, I'm sort of like crap at all three, but it keeps me busy. And he collected all this information, and he didn't really know what to do with it. So we started working together. He sent me his data. It was something like 160 gigabytes. Loaded it into SQL as one does. Started messing around with it, trying to get some sense out of it. And on the back of this we wrote quite a lot of papers that have really uncovered some important things, I think, about how the drug trade functions. Perhaps the best paper that we've had, it got in the British Medical Journal, which, for any of you that know academia, that's like super high impact. So it's basically the highest point of my career, I think. After that, yeah. So you wouldn't believe it, right? But you know, in America they got this opioid thing. It's like knocks 6 months off the average American's life expectancy. There's so many people dying in the rural areas of America of opioid overdoses. And this isn't just me shitballing it. This is actually what the government says, that this was caused by the overprescription of opioids, like for pain relief, hydrocodone and oxycodone in particular. And that just ran for ages. And you know, there's various sort of documentaries about it. I think one's called Crime of the Century. Have anyone watched that? Honestly, it's absolutely mind-blowing what's happened, and it's just a factual documentary. It's 2 hours long, and it shows you all about Purdue Pharma, who were pushing these products.
They invented pharmacy marketing in the 70s, 60s, when they called vague volume, like Mom's Little Helper, where they've made all of these opioids into something marketable to actually want people buy it.
Yeah. It's wild. It's the American bloody system, isn't it? Like, it's wild. As a British person, you can't understand it. But yeah, they really marketed opioids and got loads of people addicted to it. Anyway, eventually the government realised that lots of people were dying of oxycodone usage and heroin addiction. So they made it illegal. You used to be able to get prescriptions and then just go back and keep on getting that prescription without seeing a doctor. They made that illegal. You had to get re-prescribed regularly to be able to keep on getting your supply. And this happened in October 2014, 1st of October 2014. And we happen to have data covering online drug sales going from just before that, 2013, quarter 3 2013, to quarter 3 2016. So we were like, hang on, all these people are addicted to opioids and they can't get them anymore. Are they going to start buying them illegally? Of course they are. But there's never any evidence of that because it's impossible to get evidence about the drug system because it's always hidden. But we had this data set. So we started messing around trying to find it. And, I mean, we did some fancy stats. We used an interrupted time series approach. But, like, visually, you see, this is the schedule change. It's flat beforehand. And then afterwards, this blue line, you can't really see it too clearly, but you can see it clearly enough, starts to increase for prescription opioids, and only for prescription opioids, both in terms of sales, active products, and general listings. And it's driven actually by the change in sales, which happened first, which is kind of concrete proof that this thing drove people to the black market, we think. There's also no change in Europe, and there was no change in other products in terms of their percentages, in terms of the amount of sales of them. We saw this thing just of opioids, nothing else, directly after this change, which was great. I mean, it was a fantastic moment when I first plotted this stuff and I saw this chart and I was like, oh my days.
You said these are quite difficult to get to, these websites, so where people were using things like Tor.
Yeah, you have to use Tor to get
so
to
like
them,
the sort of the lay person was learning how to get on the
yeah, there was for a while a website called deep.web, which was like the go-to place for information about it. It had loads of step-by-step resources on, like download Tor, download Tails, download PGP, like all the exact steps on what you needed to do to technically access them. And also, this was way back in the day as well, when Bitcoin was hard to get hold of, like 2013, 2014. You couldn't just get it from Revolut or something like that. You had to either know somebody or go on local Bitcoins, or you had to go to MTGOX, which was just like, someone mentioned that started off as a card trading thing on this group round, which, I had no idea. So it was quite hard to get Bitcoin back then, but it was all laid out on various other websites. Deep.web ended up getting, I'm sort of sidetracking here, but Deep.web ended up getting busted. It was run by a couple of Israelis, and they were taking money from the referral links of people clicking through to the markets. Right. And they got done themselves for profiteering from an illegal trade. Ended up in jail. Other work we've done was we used pretty much exactly the same methodology to try and study diazepam and other sedatives usage in the UK. There was kind of a bit of a building panic a few years ago. I don't know if you remember it, about kids taking Valium and diazepam and alprazolam, Xanax as you might call it. We saw evidence of this before it really hit the mainstream. So we looked at these drug trends. And we saw this increase in the amount of sedatives being sold on the markets in the UK. And there was a feeling, and it came out and became a bit of an area of policy concern, that there were kids in middle-class Surrey villages buying sedatives and taking them at home through the darknet. And we saw that trend, which then slowly became part of the news cycle for a short period of time. Slightly different piece of work. We were looking at Australia. Australia has got wildly expensive drugs in comparison to anywhere else. Like an ecstasy tablet down there is like $100 or something like that, which is about 10 times the price of it is from Europe. And with the advent of these markets, people could literally save hundreds of dollars, even if they were buying for like 10 of their mates. Hundreds and hundreds of dollars if they thought a bit in advance and bought their drugs from Holland or from somewhere like that and got them posted over, which has got probably quite a bit of risk, but actually quite a low level of interception. You're probably going to get your stuff, and for the amount you can save, it's probably worth it. So we analysed the differentials between the prices that people were paying online from an Australian-based vendor and from a non-Australian-based vendor, and even though the risk is kind of the same, there's not actually that much risk getting a small package of drugs posted into Australia, but it's perceived to be a risk. So people were adjusting their behaviour based on perceptions of risk, which is something that the Australian Border Force was managing to make happen without there actually being that much of a different risk. And it was costing people a lot of money. We also looked at the differential between the online price and the street price. And in the vast majority of cases, the online price from an Australian vendor was very similar to the street price, except for in methamphetamine. And when we found this result, like across pretty much all of the product categories that we looked within, the street price that was reported to the police and is held like by the various drug reporting agencies, NDARC being one of them, National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, was very similar to the online price, or certainly within a variation of it, certainly within one standard deviation, except for methamphetamine, where it was much cheaper online. When we spoke to some experts, we found out that the methamphetamine market is particularly violent in Australia. It's controlled by outlaw motorcycle gangs, as they like to call them, and it is extremely violent. It's also a very pharmacologically quite violent drug. Like, you go a little bit mental when you smoke meth. So there was this like huge differential in price, which is sort of demonstrative of there being more risk within that market than there would be otherwise. So from this, we were sort of thinking, I wonder whether we can use these differentials between prices to try and understand where violence is in drug markets. Beyond that, there's been a whole other bunch of work which I haven't done or I've been involved with, or colleagues of mine have done. So one of the things that I found particularly interesting is that when left to themselves, these markets sort of function quite politely. People are very nice to each other. People give refunds. Quite often on the market, you get refunds if your drugs don't turn up. You send them a message and they'll send you some more. There's a lot of, especially for the more peculiar drugs or more harmful drugs, there's quite a lot of harm reduction messaging which the vendor will put onto the product description so that you know what you're buying. And people are quite civil. People don't want other people to die. It actually works quite well when the threat of violence or law enforcement is taken out of the picture. There's also stuff around how markets recover and stuff like that, and I could talk about that at length, but I just want to sort of finish with, I mentioned earlier on that online markets are kind of hard to use, and they are kind of hard to use. You need to know PGP, you need to know Tor, you need to know how to get on to these markets, you need to know how to rumble a Bitcoin so that it doesn't appear in your name, transfer it to a cold wallet and all this stuff. It's a bit of a hassle, yeah? So there's a lot of social media dealing. What we're trying to do, or have been trying to do until recently, I've just spent 25,000 Canadian dollars on employing a computer scientist to do this for us. Of the social media platforms which have been selling drugs, Telegram's probably the most well known. You've all heard of it, it's been in the news quite a bit recently. As I said earlier, I could probably find you a cocaine dealer who is saying that they're in Margate and willing to come here quite quickly, or I could have done last week. I'll get to that in a minute. So what we're trying to do is collect information from Telegram, because it's not really that encrypted at all, and see if we can use the same sort of approach that we've used for crypto markets to try and understand the drug trade on Telegram, see if we can reproduce that analysis. I kind of got bored of doing it on the crypto markets. They're not quite as important as they used to be, and there's a bunch of like statutory organisations which are doing it, the EMCDDA, which is the European Drug Monitoring Centre, and NDARC down in Australia. There's loads of drugs being sold. This, if you see it in better resolution, is like an automated bot where you can go onto it and order various different types of cannabis to be delivered to your house. You have to pay with Bitcoin or Monero. But there's others which are a little bit more open. And yeah, so like for instance, there's this guy here, he's called himself Plugmeister. He's got a picture of himself. For ethical reasons, I've covered his face. But he's got his own picture there with a massive knife. And he's like saying how he can sell you all these drugs. So what I've been doing recently is we've been working with some computer scientists, and if any of you are computer scientist orientated, this is kind of what my request to you is, to maybe help with these technical issues, because I'm not good enough to be able to do it. Is we've used their API, we've tried to collect a whole bunch of these channels, starting off with 25 different channels, mainly based in Berlin, because that's when I had the research idea where I was. And we collected 25 channels. We then did all the messages from them, parsed them, collected all of the links that were present within them to other channels, collected them and carried on going, so that we ended up with something like 1,300 drug channels, 1,312 drug channels that were all selling drugs in one way or another, based around Berlin. And from that, we tried to use a multiple system estimation approach, which is essentially like capture recapture, where you try and estimate the sizes of hidden populations by, the classic example might be going to an island to try and find out how many rabbits are living on it. You go out, you catch 10 rabbits, mark them, go away, go back the next day and catch some more rabbits, and the percentage of those that you've previously catched gives you an idea of the overall population. We've used a similar approach to try and estimate the size of the online markets in Berlin, and my best estimate is there's about 2,500 online telegram vendors within Berlin region. That's based from our initial start point of 15 seeds. I reckon there's about 2,500 people selling drugs via, or there were selling drugs via telegram in the Berlin region. However, it's still a little bit methodologically dodgy, and I need to make some improvements to my data collection, and that's going to be problematic because Telegram CEO Pavel Durov was arrested in France for not removing illicit material from his app, even though he well knew it was there because it wasn't actually encrypted. And they changed their terms of service 3 days ago, and to say that they will report people that are breaking the law to the authorities, and basically opened it up to a load of prosecutions. And one of my PhD students, an Italian guy called Cosimo, who is doing research on subcultures, especially this subculture called dank, which is this like cough syrupy drink in Italy. I don't know. So he's particularly engaged with these subcultures, and he reported to me yesterday that pretty much everyone's leaving Telegram because of these changes in the terms and conditions. And I've just spent, as I say, 25,000. Well, me and David, 25,000 Canadian dollars to employ a computer scientist to build us a data capture tool. And he said he's going to finish next week, and by that point, Telegram's going to be empty. So we're going to have to redo it for Signal. But yeah, that's it. I think I was talked way longer than 20 minutes, but yeah, that's all.
Where are you based?
Kent, University of Kent, yeah, UKC, yeah. Yeah, SSP, SSR as we're currently called, so the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research. Yeah.
What's the goal with the research? What's the end goal?
See, that's a good question, right? So,
is it to try and catch the people selling the
no,
drugs?
quite the opposite.
Just
right?
the knowledge.
Well, no, right. So, when me and my mate James, who I did a lot of the early work with, especially the theorising about it, when we first started talking about it, we were at a British Society of Criminology conference up in Liverpool. I'm from Wigan, which is not far away. I spent a lot of time in Liverpool, especially in my teenage years, getting up to all sorts of business. And we were having, a conversation about, and he'd written a sort of first look book of these places. And he was like, these markets are amazing. People are like really generous to each other. You've got, back in the early days, there was a lot of like political discourse that went on in there. There was a lot of libertarian. But people were very sort of positive to each other, very much harm reduction. And we kind of like saw it as, this is unencumbered by the usual structures of, there's no enforcement, there's no chance of violence. And yet these markets are working perfectly. Like, is this the gentrification of the drug market? Is it the case, and we can see for the first time, that if people are selling and buying drugs in a safe environment, they act in safe ways, and actually taking drugs in and of themselves, or the purchasing and selling of drugs, is not actually that problematic. Like, it's the enforcement and the pharmacological effects and the lack of care and the lack of healthcare that these people experience, which is actually causing the problems of drugs. It's not people smoking a bit of weed or taking a pill once every 3 weeks. Those aren't the problems. So we came at it from a perspective of a straw on the back of the end of the war on drugs, by proving that actually drug markets aren't inherently dangerous, because in these situations where we see them acting where there is no chance of, there's no government oversight, they seem to be working pretty well. People aren't killing each other. People aren't going after each other. People are very polite. So that was kind of the starting impetus to get into it. And then it was obviously the technical challenges and stuff like that. And then also, from a health perspective, a harm reduction perspective, really.
Because a lot of people would say that the idea is of the enforcement is to stop drugs getting into the hands of people overall and stopping addiction. Let's just say, for example. But I get it's people are going to get their drugs no matter what, right?
Yeah,
You know,
they are. Yeah.
What you're saying is there's no need for all the law enforcement stuff if it can reduce issues.
Well, I mean, I think there's quite a strong message that comes from criminologists. And I go to a lot of drugs policy conferences, which is that it's about harm reduction. Whatever you can do to reduce harm, and the criminalisation of people for quite often mental health problems or recreational lifestyle choices. Criminalisation of them for that causes more harm than it does good. So persecuting a heroin addict for being a heroin addict is just going to make them worse. They're going to go to jail, they're going to cycle through the system, they ain't going to get any help. You need to have harm reduction messages, you need to support those people. And that's kind of, I suppose, the position that we're coming from in terms of our work. Certainly not law enforcement. Certainly not a law enforcement assistance.
It's interesting you showed when was it OxyContin?
Yeah, hydrocodone.
The law changed there. Have you seen similar sorts of changes when various states in the US started legalising cannabis?
See, we actually tried to do some work on Canada. You know, work with Canadians to try and see whether there was a drop in the amount of illegal sales when it was made legal. It doesn't seem to be. There doesn't seem to be much of an effect now, and that's partly due to the fact that legalisation is kind of patchy at best in the States, and in Canada it's maybe it's legal to buy or to grow certain amounts, but it's not available. So like it wasn't like cannabis became legal in Canada and all of a sudden there was a shop on every street corner. There's still like quite a limited number of them, and there was also quite developed grow operations and supply chains that existed in the grey market.
So supply chains. So actually, it's still probably just easier to buy it online than if the shops weren't available, or if buying it legally was still a bit encumbered. Maybe you have to get registered or something like that. To buy it. So it might just be easier to buy it online.
You also need to consider
you wouldn't need to.
expensive healthcare. In the States, for instance, so California, when it became legal in the early 2000s, just the simple fact of getting a legal prescription, you had to go to the doctors, which cost money. Then you had to go to the pharmacist. Then you had to buy all of the whatever it was screened that it was pure, that it was whatever it is. Marketing costs came on top. So by the end, that you bought something that you could have just gotten from your man on the street. You would have had to jump through so many hoops to even get it. So just getting it on your normal illegal channels was cheaper and faster, I guess. It's probably the same in Canada as well, right?
Yeah, but we didn't see really any change in the amount of cannabis that was sold. I mean, it's such a weird drug, it's such the massive bulk of the trade. And you think, why are people doing it this way? But they are, and they're still doing it in massive numbers.
It's like delivered home.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe. Yeah, we didn't see it, no, but we looked.
Yeah.
Your work,
that's all right.
Your work's very much as a drug. Can the same techniques be used for, say, fraudulent crime or political misinformation to track what's going on?
Well, if you've got a data source, so we're trying to do, one of the Telegram group, the piece of work that we're doing, wasn't focused only at drug trade. It was trying to just be able to systematically capture data no matter what. One of the things we wanted to do, there's a lot of hacker groups on there as well. So one of the bits of information that we wanted to capture was communication amongst hacker groups to see how credentials are traded and sold. So yeah, you can use the same techniques, especially on Telegram. There's also, on some of the markets, you get card information. People sell fraudulent cards. You can buy like 100 credit card numbers and expiry dates. And yeah, we have looked at that, and other people have looked at the preponderance of credit card fraud or stolen DVDs or whatever it might be, or files or whatever it might be, using exactly the same techniques. Yeah, I've focused on drugs in my research and my talk here because I think that's most interesting, and it's got the most clean data. The other things, like the data's a bit more messy, like the hacker forums tend to be very unstructured chat logs, and whilst you can do some stylometrics and natural language processing to try and extract meaning, it's quite a challenge to do it at scale, especially, I mean, they know what they're doing, hackers, don't they? They speak in a different language. They do it to confuse people, and you try and point a computer at that to understand it, it struggles. So yes, you can, if you can get the data, but it's easiest with drugs.
Do you know, Jack, if there's any change in, since the online availability increases, is there an increase in overall drug use, or does it stay pretty static?
Well, that's a good question, mate. There's been work that's looked at people's drug using habits on an individual level. It's very hard to do at a population level because you don't know what the drug use level is anyway. But on an individual level, there is some evidence that people, when they first find out about these things, increase their drug consumption for a short period of time before it drops down. But one thing that stays higher is the variety of drugs that people seem to take. So as previously you might be taking MDMA and weed, all of a sudden you can get whatever you want. So people are sort of taking more variety of drugs, but not necessarily more regular. Part of that is related to the types of people who use these methods of purchasing. They tend to be slightly more highly educated, slightly older. When I say older, I mean not like teenagers. And usually male, mid-20 male type character who's got a university degree, more white people. So yeah, it's kind of a different... you don't know whether it's just because you're looking at a different section of the population, or they're actually got, so it's hard to disentangle.
How do you know that it's male, white, mid-20s?
So
They don't sign up with their date of birth.
No. So that information comes from a survey called the Global Drug Survey, which is a survey, it's a convenience sample of people that report using drugs. It's promoted in it started off in Mix Mag, if you remember Mix Mag. It was like the Ravers magazine, and it was promoted through that, and it's been running for about 10 years now. I think it's come to the end of its life really, but they've translated into 15, 16 different languages. It runs all over the world. They get millions of responses every time they run it, and that has asked a battery of questions around whether people have bought from the online markets, and has done since 2014.
So it's too early to say whether this has had a beneficial effect in terms of eliminating the crime that goes with drug trading, because you're kind of cleaning up the whole transactional piece, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're cleaning up all the crime and infighting that goes on around
by
supply,
just removing it,
by moving it up. But obviously there's still a big ecosystem.
There's a massive ecosystem,
exists.
Yeah.
Is there any idea of the sort of
the scales
size between the two?
Yeah, there is. I can't remember the numbers. I should have revised this before I came. But it's like a tiny fraction on these markets. It's 5% of the trade. Oh God, I can't remember the size of the international drug trade, but it's absolutely massive. It's like billions and billions of dollars a year. And these things, I think at its height, Silk Road did $250 million worth of trade in a month, and then it disappeared. So, or is it in a year? I can't quite remember.
Because if it was really big, the establishment would have to hit back, wouldn't they?
Well, they do, and that's what happened to Dreadpire Roberts. And I didn't get into some of the more amazing stings that have happened with Alpha Bay and Hansa, which was brilliant. So one of the things I often see with markets is that when one gets taken down, everyone runs off to the next one, the next biggest, longest lasting one. And the Americans took down Alpha Bay, which at the time was the largest market available, and it was getting quite famous. It was almost as big as Silk Road, in terms of its sort of cultural reach. And the American police took it down, and everyone ran off Alpha Bay and went to Hansa, which was the second largest at the time. And then just around about that time, Hansa said, "Oh, we've lost all our pictures because everyone's coming. Can you all send us the pictures of your products again?" So loads of people did. And then the Dutch police were like, haha, surprise, we've been running Hansa for the last month. And loads of these drug dealers had re-uploaded photos with the metadata still on. So it had like the IP address and the address of where they took the photo, like on the bottom. So they sent the police around and nicked loads of them. So like they are doing something about it, but I don't think it's because they're a big part of the overall drug trade, but because they kind of get quite a lot of media attention.
Yeah.
Silk Road was kind of in the news quite a lot. Alphabet was in the news a lot. So was Hansa and stuff.
I was actually thinking about the establishment as in, the drug dealers.
Oh, the drug dealers.
Yeah. Because obviously they're going to have to up their game if they, unless
Oh,
they want to
right.
be left
Oh, I see what you
behind.
mean.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I reckon they're well into it. They're like, yeah, it's cool. We can sell drugs on the internet. It's brilliant.
Oh, so they're involved.
Yeah, of
Oh,
course
okay,
they are.
right.
Yeah, they must be.
Is there some, I mean, when you think of like legal business, everybody goes from very analog to digital, and just you have to do your business on websites and so on. Do you have any insight of like these really huge cartels? And I don't know, but people that run Mexico, people that used to run Colombia and so on, they send submarines around just full of heroin.
Yeah.
Do you know like how they modernize, how they try to get into that market, or are there current, I don't know, violence, prostitution, trafficking? Is it just like one little diversity that they are more likely to keep like on the ground in the violence, in the street gangs, or is there any?
Yeah, I
research
can
done on
answer that.
on
Yeah, I've got
side?
some. Yeah, right. So essentially, what I'm talking about is that the start point. I talked about how the communication of across a network computer for a small amount of drugs was one of the first things that people used, being able to communicate personally on the ARPANET. And basically, what I'm talking about, I mean, in my research, we've been able to use capturing those communications to be able to sort of understand things. But yeah, crime, like nefarious behaviour, crime, and the ability to communicate with people without other people listening is absolutely central to the conducting crime. And yeah, there is technology, as with all of our lives, has become embedded into it. So, WhatsApp, Telegram, etc. is something that we all use all the time. And the higher up the drug trade or the whatever criminal enterprise you go, communication has been affected by electronic communication. Yeah, there's been a great thing about EncroChat. Have you heard about EncroChat or Anom? These were two encrypted interfaces that would run on your phone. You had to do like a special configuration with your fingers, and then it would load up a parallel operating system on your normal mobile phone, and that would be an encrypted way of communicating with other people who also had that system. There's one called EncroChat. There's another in America called Anom. There's probably loads more besides this, but both Anom and EncroChat had actually been compromised by the French authorities, and one had been built by the FBI. And sold to the criminal networks so that they were communicating with each other on what they thought were encrypted phones when they're actually being run by the bloody police. And then, they facilitated it for a long period of time. So, yeah, there's the higher, I'm sure there are loads of other of these encrypted phone systems which are existing, which aren't being run by the authorities. We just know about the ones that have been run by the authorities because they've fallen. So yeah, in short, communication technology is embedded in all aspects of crime, as it is embedded in all aspects of our lives. Yeah.
My question was more like in the sense is like, is that a market that is even, or is it a market share that's even threatening to people that are in those big cartels? Because you described it earlier about how you found that the trading and the communication was quite polite and quite almost a bit romantic in a way, when you just think of other crimes where you think all of the violence in order to get to drugs because of poverty and like all that comes with it, prostitution or that sort of thing. So that seems very dirty and very like not very middle class. So what I hear from you is more like university degrees and just like like that sort of bit more educated maybe with software and so on. So I just wonder, is that something that you've seen, anything that you get, that those good little traders get into conflict with, like the bad people? That was my question.
Oh right, okay, I see
If
what you
you've
mean.
ever- if you've
I see what
ever
you mean. I
looked
see what you
into
mean.
that.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
misunderstood you. I mean, people are getting involved in the drug trade. I'm sure they're going to run up against the hard realities of it if they step on someone's toes. One thing that online methods of, especially the crypto markets, probably less so with social media dealing, is you don't know who anybody is. I mean, you've still got to source your product. That's a pinch point. But if you're able to source your product and sell it and pay the person you're sourcing it from, they're probably quite I mean, I don't know, I'm speculating, but they're probably quite happy they're selling their brick of cocaine a month or whatever it is they're doing. And if you're able to trade it without coming into contact with anybody, that's your business. So would they then get dragged into the wider mess of the drug trade? I'm sure it's happened. This is one of this is kind of, you never really know, do you? Unless you take non-technological approaches and do quite in-depth conversations with people who've been arrested of these things. My cousin, my wife's cousin, my wife's Romanian, he set himself up as a small-time drug dealer, and he was buying his drugs from the internet, and he got in trouble with the local lads because he was cutting into their market. And then he all of a sudden got arrested just after he got a delivery and spent 5 years in jail. So yeah, I'm sure people are getting sort of dragged into this, into the wider mess. But yeah.
Is there an online wholesaler market, like a book of cash and carry for drugs?
Yeah,
Probably.
yeah, there is. Yes, so
What's the qualification to be able to use
Criteria.
that market?
you've bought drugs before. So the markets quite often do a bulk discount. So if you buy one pill, it'll be however much. If you buy 10, it'll be more. If you buy 100, it'll be a little bit cheaper. But people tend to build relationships with the same vendor. So you trust that guy who sent it to you last time. You go back, you bought 10, you buy 100, you buy another 100. You have to personally communicate with that person to send your address, usually through PGP, with an encrypted message. But you're actually communicating directly with that vendor. It might be only for a brief time to just send your address. But there is quite a lot of evidence of not only bulk discounts on the markets, also people moving off market to just do it via personal communication. So yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence for people who have moved up to become medium level suppliers, and business to business supply does happen on these markets. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? I think that deserves another round of applause
Yeah.
before we finish.